It's difficult for me to go back and try to quantify how I felt or what I was thinking. To actually be able to put myself into the situation. It always, for a long time, I know it seemed that I was looking at it from outside. It just seemed like watching something on the screen, not as something that I was really experiencing. My name is Miguel Angel Martinez. I was convicted of capital murder, and I was sentenced to death. I look back and I don't see myself having a very different life or experience than most average teenagers. Going to school, meeting people, wanting to go out to parties. I remember it was a weekday, but I think we were on vacation for something. It was in the early afternoon that I saw Venegas, who I knew from school. I had one class with him. And he told me about a party that was supposed to be happening that night, and about going to see Milo Flores. He was a person that I hung out with. I would go to his house and we would go to parties together. Venegas was 16 at that time. Flores was 17, and I was 17. Milo basically had his own apartment behind his parents' house. His father was wealthy, at least in my eyes. Milo had the means to get drugs that I didn't, so that was what joined us. That was smoking marijuana and doing cocaine. Venegas had a tendency to do a lot and get very, very expressive. It wasn't somebody that I necessarily enjoyed having around. It might have been close to midnight. He was very excited. He was very hyper, and he wanted to go do something. Right then and there, go outside and stone a car, stone a house, do something. And that's what happened that night. I can't say that there was a reason, or that there was a planning or an intention really behind going to this particular house. Milo and I had been there before a couple of times, and we had already used some keys to get into the house and take things out, which we exchanged for drugs. I knew the person that lived there. I knew he lived alone. As a matter of fact, I had been working for him in the past. I met him when I was 15 years old. He took an interest in me. It was, I think it can be considered him seeing somebody that needed a father, or him seeing somebody that was disadvantaged and trying to help. I had been given keys to his house on several occasions. I actually stayed with him at night. Going to work the next morning, he was my ride, I guess. And so we decided to go to that house. It was supposed to be what we had done before. Nobody home, go in and take something. And what Venegas was insistent upon was doing some damage, tearing something up. And so what we took with us were a baseball bat, an axe, and some knives. Milo dropped us off about 2 blocks away so that he could make a slow circuit, give him enough time to drive around, and then come pick us up. It was not supposed to take very long. When we got to the house, I had a bad feeling, I guess. Venegas walks over to the house, and when he came back, he tells me there's somebody in the house, which was a surprise, a shock. And my thoughts were to get away. My thoughts were, I need to get out of here. Everything had switched. There was something that changed with him. He was on a mission, and it was not to go steal anything. It was not to go trash anything. To him, he was on a mission for Satan. Satan wanted their souls. The reason that I didn't leave, I was scared of him at that point. In memory, things seemed to go slow from that point on. And I can't really explain how the sequence happens, or how long between one memory or one flash of memory to the other. But I remember standing over a guy sleeping on the couch, which was a few feet away from the entrance. I mean, I couldn't say how old he was. I couldn't say I even knew what he looked like. Venegas had the axe. And he hit them. He hit him one time. And he had a knife and I had a knife. And he started stabbing the guy on the couch. I don't know how long it took. I don't know how long it really was. It seems to have been something very quick. And the part that I remember is Venegas looking up at me with the knife and telling me it was my turn. And I had a folding knife. And so I unfolded it and looked at the body that was laying there below me, and I stabbed him and walked away. Walked towards the back of the house where there was a sliding door that led into the backyard. And I don't know how long I was out there. It had to be enough time that when I came back in, Venegas was standing there. What I didn't know was that during that time that I was outside, he had stabbed one other person who was in one of the rooms. What I remember is saying that I wanted to leave, and he told me to give him the axe, and he walked back down the hallway into the back room. I didn't see what he did. When he came back, he told me there was a guy back there, and that Satan wanted their soul. We took one TV that was in the living room and his car, and we drove to Milo's house. We drove down the street where he was supposed to be waiting, but he wasn't there. So we went to his house, and he told me not to go in, that he was going to go talk to Milo, and he came back. I don't know how long it was. From there, I remember going with Venegas and going to other people's houses. When I got home, it was late afternoon. And I never saw Venegas again. I remember Milo telling me that he wanted to talk to me that night. He was worried about Venegas saying something about him, and that was the last time I spoke to Milo before I got arrested.
Not even when we think about it. Thank you, Lord, for your miracles in our lives and in our hearts. Lord, fill us with your Spirit today. But Lord, as the sermon comes, my name is Jay Dickey, and this is First Baptist Church. We will be attentive to everything that Pastor Ben has to say. Nobody would have thought, of all people, that Jim Smiley would be someone who would have been attacked like that.
But we never actually take the time to share the gospel with people. Don't do that.
James had or Jim as we called him, had a really fabulous personality and a great gift of sense of humor and that kind of stuff. Jim did some mission work in Nuevo Laredo with this orphanage that he was helping some missionaries with. He spent a lot of time going back and forth and using a lot of his own resources to do that. He just loved people, so he was always involved in one way or another, helping out with families who had needs, but also with a youth group. We had a fairly large youth group, and Jim got really involved in that and in other parts of the church. Nobody could believe that something like that would happen, especially to Jim Smiley. I mean, he'd give the shirt off his back to you to help you out if you needed it. We lost 3 people who had no reason to die whatsoever. And then as we take the offering, the Well, as a Christian, I have to believe that anyone can be redeemed. But and there was a suggestion that there had been some kind of a satanic ritual first.
Forgive us where we've
And it was an axe.
In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
That's pretty extreme.
The tip of the iceberg, the tip of the pyramid on any police job is homicide, because you get to investigate the killing of another human being. I'm gonna make a right turn over here, and then we're gonna start going towards the house. I truly remember that day. I was the only detective working at the time. It was nighttime, and my beeper started going. So I called the police station, and they tell me, look, the officer that showed up to this house, they found dead bodies out there. So he's requesting a homicide detective out there. This is it. So I just drove up to the scene here, and of course there were several police cars with lights on already here. And then the first officer on the scene, he gave me a briefing what he saw inside the house. After that, I decided to walk inside the house. What caught my attention was the level of violence that was used to kill these three people out there. Their bodies, their heads were smashed, they were hit, they were slashed in a way that the level of violence was incredible. And apparently everybody was asleep at the time. The youngest victim, 14 years old, most likely put up a fight, and signs in the room that he actually struggled for his own life. The other two victims, they were killed at the sled. Another concerning thing that in the master bedroom where the owner of the house was killed, there was a crucifix that was actually turned upside down. Had the person responsible done that as a sign, as a devil worshipping, or is it just as a prank? We have no idea. By seeing that there was not a forced entry type of issue, it was the person responsible entered the house with a key. Most of the homicides are committed by people unknown to the victim. And one of the defendants, Miguel Martinez, turned out to be an ex-employee of Mr. Smiley, who was the owner of the house. The other one was Miguel Venegas. There were the two people directly responsible for the killings. Of course, they had a third friend out there who facilitated and loaned them those, what we call now the murder weapons. And it became a huge issue here that was the son of a local district judge.
My name is Manuel Flores. I'm a native Laredoan. I've been a practicing attorney since 1975. 20 years as a district judge, 4 years as a county court at law judge. I never thought the kinds of cases that I would hear that someday those issues would visit me personally. It was a morning, and I was getting ready to go to work, and 2 police officers knocked on my door. And as I recall, they told me, you know, this axe murder that's been in the news, we understand the axe is here at your home. And of course, I was shocked. And so I inquired of my son, and son, did somebody borrow the axe? And he said, yes. And where is it? He said, it's here by the wood pile. I said, well, go get it. I got it, and I gave it to them. No questions asked.
Come on, Crystal. Good girl.
Then I think it was Investigator Torres asked me if he could interview my son. I had this great fear that maybe he had been involved, that maybe he had done something. But he explained that he may have been together with Martinez there at the house, and then Venegas showed up, or Venegas and Martinez showed up. I don't remember exactly how it happened, but in any event, he explained that they were talking about going to trash a house to do something bad to someone who appeared to be good but was really bad. And asked them, well, why did they take your knife, and why did they take the axe that was outside there in the carport? And he said, well, they wanted a gun, but I told them no. And since all they were going to do is trash a house, I thought nothing of it. And what I wanted to do was get rid of them because they were acting real strange. You know, my son had access to our guns. And later on, I found out that he lied to him to make up the story to not give him a gun. He's a gentle, gentle person who would never hurt anybody. Investigator Torres said, look, we know exactly what happened. The 2 boys that committed those murders have both confessed and explained how it happened. And based on the circumstances, your son could not have known what was going to happen. The facts are he left. And they themselves said they had not formulated the idea to kill anybody. It was an idea that Venegas had after they entered and found out there were people sleeping in there, and when they started to leave, that Venegas said something to the effect, let's go back and take their souls. But that was just the beginning of the story, because my son testified that they had been at my house, and my son had given them a ride into that neighborhood where they committed the offense. When that got in the paper, that gave rise to a lot of problems. And people were talking, and the assumption was that I had used some kind of influence to save my son from being prosecuted, and nothing could be further from the truth. I would have preferred for him to be accused and face a jury of his peers, and that he would have been declared innocent, because there were no facts that showed any guilt. That's why I don't want him to get involved. I don't want all the crazies out there to put him through the anguish and the agony that he had since 1991. And I just want him to live a normal life and be done with this. And I wish it would go away.
You get the first call. You get there and you secure the evidence, secure the area, and you start investigating from zero. These are the weapons that were used. ¿Salió? The axe is here. This is what I call hands-on. When you crack somebody's skull with that, and the blood's squirting everywhere, crunching of the bone. These are hands-on weapons. It takes a lot, you know. You have to be really into what you're doing. Yeah, it's not like I did it and I didn't know what I was doing. No, it's something that you do, and then you go to a next room and you do it again, and then you go to a next room and do it again. You know, it's actually like a continuing thing in your mind to do these evil things. One of the perpetrators said that the devil told him to go back and take their souls. And you say, well, how could the devil be involved? Well, I think this case could have been induced by drugs, because apparently they were using some drugs. And you can get an induced high that would create hallucinations and might create the voice, you know. In this case, I don't know. I think you need to ask the one that did it. If you believe in God and God believes in the devil, you know that the devil's out there.
Now, what I'm about to tell you, I stopped myself from telling anybody. Because of parole and what are they going to think about me? The warp in my mind happened when I was 8 years old, 7 or 8 years old. At 8 years old, I became convinced that I was the son of a devil. In Juarez, there used to be a bunch of black widows, you know, those spiders. And I would tell myself, if I'm the son of the devil, none of these spiders is going to bite me. And I would fill up a jar of black widows. I'd go catch them and take off my shirt, be on the ground. And I'd tell my friends, I'm the son of the devil. And I'd just put those black widows on my chest. None of them ever bit me. So I'm convincing myself that I'm the son of the devil because of this. That was a little phase that I went through. And then as it came, it went. I met Martinez in my sophomore year in a pre-algebra class. I didn't know Manuel Flores. I didn't know his dad was a judge. It came out that one night we're, snorting some line. And Manuel Flores, he kind of like hinted, hey man, I'm always pulling out the coke, which was true. He was the one that had money. We didn't have no money. I don't like for anybody to say that to me. I don't like mooching, I don't like taking stuff from somebody. So I said, hey, well, what can we do, I mean, we ain't got no money. So it so happened that Martinez had a key to this house. And they came up with the idea to go steal. Because supposedly, this guy had a stash of money. Because Martinez knew him. I'm like, sounds all right, sounds good. it sounds like a plan. I'm like, well, how are we gonna scare this dude into giving us money? Manuel Flores said, well, I got a gun. I'm like, okay, so, I'm wired up. Let's go do it, because I want some more cocaine. And Manuel's like, well, hold on, and he takes off. He comes back and he says, nah, well, my dad put the gun in the locker and locked it. And I said, well, lend me your knives. He was always sharpening some knives that he had. Okay. I said, take me to your shed, right? So we go to his shed, and I'm looking, and there's an axe. And there's a bat. I said, well, yeah, we'll take that, and we'll take a bat. And I said, well, why don't we just kill the dude then? Like, you won't do that. I come from a machista culture. A dare is a dare. I had been doing some hallucinogens during the day. And, well, add the cocaine to that. But I still kind of knew what I was doing, He gives us a ride, and he takes off. So we go to this place. And we look through the windows, and I see that there's 3 dudes in here. And now everything's changed. Oh man, we should go, and I'm like, we can't go anywhere. And it seeps in my mind. I have to kill these 3 people. And then I remember when I was younger with the spiders, I saw it as a sign. And I say, it's more souls to the devil. So we go to the guy, he's in the couch, and he's asleep. And I got the axe. And I'm just like thinking about it, and I'm like, but I'm high too. And at the same time, I want to pump myself up to do it. And the guy wakes up. He wakes up and he looks at me. And he goes back to sleep. And I'm thinking to myself, oh, the devil's got my back. That's what I became convinced of. I strike him with the axe. And then, I don't know whether I left the axe on his head or I took it off and put it to the side, and I started stabbing him in the chest. Martinez said that he only stabbed the guy 1 time. I don't know if he did or not. I don't know if it was 1 time, 2 times, 3. I was focused on something else. I was thinking, I need to get out of here. I need to kill these people and get out of here. That's what I was thinking. Before long, I see that Martinez is not there anymore. Later on, I came to find out that he went outside to puke. He comes back in, and he's like, man, I don't want to do this. I said, hey, don't step out of this house again until we do this, or the devil's going to kill us. That's what was in my head. That's what I believed. That's what I thought. I said, so, I said, look, just go to the side, man. I'll take care of the rest. I went to the kids. I didn't know he was a kid until I got in there, started stabbing him in the stomach, and I heard his voice. Hey, man, he told me, hey, man, and I'm like, and then I seen him, and he's a kid. I go next door to where Smiley was sleeping, and I did this. I got the axe, chopped him in the head, and that was it. We didn't find no money. We took a TV, VCR, little rings or whatever the hell. I turned some crucifixes upside down. We took the car. And I was happy because I was not gonna die. That was the main reason why I did that. Whether it makes sense to anybody, made sense to me. I took 3 lives. I did that. I can't lie. I can't say that I did not do something so heinous. And the 41 years that were given to me is just like a little slap in the hand. I see, even if I do the whole time, which probably is gonna happen, even if I do the whole time, it won't pay for 1 life, man.
I can't say that there was a reason, that there was a planning or an intention really behind going to this particular house. I knew the person that lived there. I knew he lived alone. As a matter of fact, I had been working for him. It was supposed to be what we had done before. Nobody home, go in and take something. And what Venegas was insisting upon was doing some damage, tearing something up.
I don't remember it like that. And he seems to have selective memory. I mean, we all do. I'm not trying to transfer him because we're in it together. He came up with the idea to go to that house. He knew what we were gonna do. We shared the blame. Whether he accepts the fact or whether he's, I thought he was kidding, or no, you participated. And he doesn't mention anything, or he doesn't go into detail as to his relationship to Mr. Smiley. He doesn't even want to say his name. Now, when we're in the house and I asked him, well, who's this guy? Ah, man, he's just some faggot. That's what he said. He's a faggot. Smiley was a pedophile. At least that's what my lawyer told me. First lawyer that I had. And I'm so young, I said, what the hell is a pedophile? He says, man, I have families willing to testify in court that Mr. Smiley messed with their kids. I don't know what kind of story Martinez told y'all, but he had lived with this man.
My name is Joe Rubio. I was the district attorney for 20 years here in Webb County. I was the lead prosecutor prosecuting the capital murder case against Miguel Angel Martinez. There had been a lot of rumors about, Jim Smiley, and there was never any evidence to substantiate that at all. On the contrary, everyone that we interviewed not only thought but believed in Jim Smiley, that he was an outstanding citizen. I don't know if some people just do it maliciously. They just pass on, they just want to gossip, and they perpetuate those rumors. For me to even have to comment and say that he wasn't involved in improper activity still casts a shadow on him, and we never had any evidence of that whatsoever, other than he just was dedicated to his family, his church, his work. After Miguel Angel Martinez received the death penalty, he was one of the youngest defendants on death row. We had offered Martinez, in return for his plea of guilty, a life imprisonment. He didn't want to take that plea, so he forced us to trial, and when we went to trial, he got the death penalty. We had gotten a lot of communications from a lot of people, and so we sat down, and I decided that although we had been successful in achieving the capital murder conviction, I didn't think it was fair for him to get the death penalty, and the co-defendant, who we felt was more culpable, who was more of the instigator, could not, under the law, get the death penalty. So we agreed to commute his sentence.
They came up with the idea to go steal. And I said, well, why don't we just kill the dude then? You won't do that. I come from a machista culture. A dare is a dare.
Well, I don't want to speculate, as to, whether it happened or not. I guess it's a fact situation as to what the what type of credibility that person had. How long have you known him? How long have you been around him? The evidence shows that there was drug use during that day, a lot of drug use, a lot of drinking alcohol, and a lot of times people say things and they don't really mean it. They're just boasting. I believe that they actually formed their intent once they got there. When Venegas says the devil wants their souls, that's when they turned around to go back into the home and committed the homicides. Our position was that that's where they formed the intent. The Flores kid did not go over there with them. He was never there. The case was presented to a grand jury. They took a look at all the evidence, and they decided that they felt that there was evidence to indict Venegas and Martinez, but not Milo Flores. Later on, it was looked at by the Texas Rangers. The FBI took a look at it as well, and no other charges. Nobody else came up with a different conclusion.
I don't think I've ever said that Milo was specifically responsible for anything. I mean, that's not to say that he wasn't or that there isn't something.
There was a killer moving through California for more than a decade, and for years, investigators could not even put a face to the name they were searching for because there was no name. There was only a pattern, a series of attacks, a trail of victims, a shadow that appeared at night and disappeared before anyone could stop him. He broke into homes. He stalked neighborhoods. He terrorized families. He raped women and girls. He murdered people. And then, just as suddenly as the attacks had begun, the killings stopped. The silence lasted for decades, but the case never truly disappeared. Somewhere inside evidence lockers and aging police files was the biological signature of a man who had believed he would never be identified. For more than 40 years, that DNA waited. Then, in 2018, investigators found a way to make it speak. The discovery would expose the identity of a man who had spent decades living an ordinary life while investigators across California were still trying to understand the nightmare he had created. His name was Joseph James D'Angelo. But before investigators knew that name, before the arrest stunned the nation, there was only the killer. His crimes began in the 1970s when California communities were being terrorized by a predator who seemed almost impossible to catch. The attacks were initially investigated as separate crimes, and the terminology surrounding the offender changed over time as law enforcement gradually recognized connections between cases. In Sacramento County, he became known as the East Area Rapist. Later, the same offender was connected to murders in Southern California, where investigators used another name, the original Night Stalker. For years, authorities did not know whether these crimes were committed by the same person. The uncertainty made the investigation even more difficult. The offender moved through different jurisdictions. He changed his behavior. He left frightened witnesses behind, but few opportunities for investigators to identify him. And because the crime stretched across years and counties, the case became a massive puzzle scattered across California. Victims experienced the crimes individually, but investigators eventually understood that the individual attacks were part of something much larger. The offender was not simply committing isolated crime. He was creating a pattern. He watched homes. He studied routines. He selected victims. He entered houses at night. He controlled the people inside. He left them terrified and uncertain about whether he would return. For the communities affected, the fear was not abstract. It was immediate. Doors were checked repeatedly. Windows became potential entry points. Darkness became something to fear. A quiet neighborhood could suddenly become the scene of a crime. The killer seemed to understand that fear itself was a weapon. The uncertainty became part of his power. Victims could not see him clearly. Investigators could not identify him, and the public could not know where he might strike next. Yet the killer made mistakes. Every crime creates evidence, even when the person responsible believes otherwise. In these cases, biological evidence was collected and preserved. Investigators eventually obtained DNA from crime scenes. That DNA became one of the most important pieces of evidence in the entire investigation because it established something extraordinary. The same unknown male was connected to multiple crimes. Long before investigators knew his name, they knew his genetic signature. That fact would become critical decades later, but during the original investigation, DNA technology was not capable of delivering the answer investigators needed. The evidence could tell them that the same person was responsible for different crimes, but it could not simply produce a name. There was no searchable national database containing the killer's identity. There was no genetic genealogy platform investigators could immediately use. The technology required to transform a DNA profile into a family tree did not yet exist in practical investigative form, so the case remained open. Years passed, then decades. The killer's identity remained hidden. Investigators continued to work the case, but each passing year made the possibility of an arrest seem more remote. Witnesses aged. Memories faded. Investigators retired. Victims grew older. Families carried the consequences of crimes committed when they were young. The case became one of the most notorious unsolved investigations in California history. And yet the DNA remained. That was the strange contradiction at the heart of the investigation. The authorities possessed evidence that could identify the offender if the right technology ever became available, but they had no way to connect the evidence to a specific person. The killer could remain free because science had reached the limit of what it could do at the time. Then genetics changed. As consumer DNA testing became increasingly popular, millions of people began submitting genetic information to companies and databases to learn about ancestry and family relationship. Most users were looking for relatives or trying to understand where their families came from. They were not thinking about unsolved murder, but investigators realized that the same genetic information could potentially be used in another way. If an unknown crime scene DNA profile could be compared with genetic information in a genealogy database, investigators might find distant relatives of the unknown offender. Those relatives could become the starting points for constructing a family tree. The goal was not to find the killer directly. It was to find the family. Then, from the family, investigators could narrow the possibilities until they reached the person whose age, sex, location, and other characteristics matched the offender. This approach became known as investigative genetic genealogy, and in the Golden State Killer investigation, it would change everything. The breakthrough did not happen overnight. Investigators had to revisit evidence that had been collected decades earlier. They had to ensure that the DNA profile was reliable. They had to work with specialists capable of conducting genealogical research, and they had to operate within a developing area of forensic investigation that raised new legal and ethical questions. But the possibility was extraordinary. For decades, investigators had possessed the killer's DNA without knowing his identity. Now they had a potential method for turning that biological evidence into a genealogical map. The case was no longer limited to traditional investigative technique. The killer's own DNA could potentially lead investigators backward through generations of family relationships. The first major breakthrough came when investigators used the crime scene DNA profile with a genealogy database. The search did not immediately return the killer's name. Instead, it produced distant relatives. That might sound like a failure. It was not. Those relatives were clues. Each relationship provided another branch of the family tree. Investigators and genealogists began reconstructing the biological connections. They looked for common ancestors. They followed branches. They eliminated people who could not fit the evidence. Slowly, the enormous family tree began to narrow. The unknown offender was no longer just an anonymous DNA profile. He was connected to a real family. Somewhere in that family was a man who matched the genetic evidence. The investigators still had to be careful. A genealogical match to a relative did not prove that the relative's family member was the killer. The process generated leads, not automatic conviction. Investigators had to identify a specific suspect and then independently confirm the suspect's DNA. That distinction was essential. The genealogy pointed toward a family. Traditional police work would have to identify the individual. The investigation eventually focused on Joseph James D'Angelo, a former police officer who had lived in California for decades. The revelation was stunning. The man investigators had been searching for was not hiding in some remote location. He had lived a seemingly ordinary life. He had been married. He had children. He had worked as a police officer before retiring. He had grown older while the victims and investigators continued carrying the memory of the crime. The idea that the killer could have been living within ordinary society for decades made the breakthrough even more shocking. Investigators now had a name, but they needed proof. They could not arrest a man simply because genealogy had pointed toward him. They needed to establish that D'Angelo's DNA matched the biological evidence collected from the crimes, so investigators began watching him. They waited for an opportunity to collect DNA without alerting him to the investigation. Eventually, discarded biological material provided the comparison investigators needed. The DNA matched. The anonymous genetic signature preserved from crimes committed decades earlier was connected to Joseph James D'Angelo. The man investigators had sought for more than 40 years had finally been identified. In April 2018, authorities arrested D'Angelo at his home in Citrus Heights, California. The arrest sent shockwaves through the country. A case that had haunted California for decades had suddenly been solved. The Golden State Killer was no longer an unknown figure. He had a name. He had an address. He had a fate. And most importantly, investigators now had the scientific evidence connecting him to the crimes. For the victims and their families, the news was almost impossible to process. Some had spent decades wondering whether the man who attacked them would ever be found. Others had lived with the deaths of loved ones and the knowledge that the killer had remained free. The arrest did not erase what had happened. It did not return the lives that had been taken, but it ended one of the most agonizing uncertainties in the case, the identity of the man responsible. The breakthrough also transformed the way investigators and the public understood the power of DNA. For more than 40 years, the killer's genetic evidence had existed without a name attached to it. The evidence was waiting for science to catch up. When genealogy finally provided the missing bridge, the killer's anonymity collapsed with extraordinary speed. What investigators had once considered an impossible identification became a matter of tracing family relationships. The same DNA that had been silent for decades suddenly became a roadmap. It led from an unknown offender to distant relatives, from relatives to a family tree, and from that family tree to Joseph James D'Angelo. But the arrest was only the beginning of another chapter. Investigators now had to determine the full scope of the crimes connected to him. Prosecutors had to build a case capable of surviving in court. Victims who had spent decades trying to move forward were suddenly confronted with the possibility of facing their attacker again, and the public began asking a question that had haunted the investigation from the beginning. How could a man responsible for such a long series of crimes remain unidentified for so many years? The answer was hidden in the same passage of time that had protected him. The world of forensic science had changed. Genetic genealogy had emerged. Old evidence had become new evidence, and the killer's own biological signature, preserved from crimes committed decades earlier, had finally become the key that unlocked his identity. The nightmare had begun in the 1970s, the silence had lasted through the 1980s, the 1990s, and the first years of the new millennium. Victims had grown older, investigators had retired, the case had become legendary. But the DNA never forgot. It waited in the evidence. And when investigators finally found a way to connect that DNA to a family tree, the man who had hidden behind an unknown name for more than 40 years suddenly became Joseph James D'Angelo, a living suspect standing on the other side of the evidence. The longest silence in the investigation was over. The killer had finally been found. The arrest of Joseph James D'Angelo did not erase the decades of fear that had surrounded the case. If anything, it forced investigators, victims, families, and the public to confront the full scale of what had remained hidden for so long. For more than 40 years, the Golden State Killer had existed as a figure without a confirmed identity, a man known through descriptions, crime scene, evidence, and the memories of people who had survived encounters with him. Now there was a face attached to the name. There was a house. There was a family history. There was a former career in law enforcement, and there was DNA connecting him to crimes that had haunted California for generations. The contrast was staggering. The killer had not disappeared into some distant world. He had grown older in ordinary surroundings while the investigation remained one of the most notorious cold cases in the United States. The revelation immediately raised another question. Who exactly was Joseph James D'Angelo? And how had a man who once worked as a police officer managed to remain unidentified for so long? D'Angelo was born in 1945 and grew up in California. He later served in the United States Navy and attended California State University, Sacramento. In the 1970s, he became a police officer. He worked for the Exeter Police Department and later the Auburn Police Department. His career in law enforcement was particularly disturbing in light of the crimes eventually attributed to him. A police officer is expected to understand the investigative process, the methods used to collect evidence, and the behavior of criminals trying to avoid detection. If investigators were correct, D'Angelo had been committing some of the crimes during the same period in which he was employed as an officer. That possibility added another layer of shock to the case. The man investigators were trying to find had potentially understood the system searching for him. He knew what police looked for. He understood how evidence could be gathered. He knew how investigators communicated, and yet he left behind biological evidence that would ultimately become the key to his identification. The crimes themselves had already demonstrated a high degree of planning. The offender often appeared to know how to control a situation before his victims could react. He entered homes at night. He moved through neighborhoods. He exploited darkness and surprise. He created fear before anyone could even understand what was happening. In the early years, investigators struggled to determine whether the crimes were connected. Different jurisdictions had different reports. Different names were used. The offender's behavior changed. Some crimes involved sexual assault, others involved murder. The geographic distance between Northern and Southern California made the connection even harder to establish. But investigators eventually recognized that the same offender was responsible for a much larger series of crimes than initially believed. The name East Area Rapist became associated with the attacks in Northern California. Later, the crimes in Southern California were connected to the original Night Stalker. Eventually, investigators concluded that the two offenders were the same person. That realization transformed the case from a regional investigation into a statewide hunt for a single predator, yet the killer remained unidentified. Years became decades. The case generated public attention, but no arrest. Investigators developed theories and followed leads, but none produced the evidence necessary to identify the offender. The DNA profile remained one of the strongest pieces of evidence. It could establish that crimes were connected. It could exclude suspects. But without a matching database entry, it could not reveal the name behind the genetic profile. This was the central problem. Traditional forensic DNA databases were designed primarily to compare crime scene DNA with known individuals whose genetic information was already in the system. If the killer had never been arrested for an offense that resulted in a qualifying DNA sample, there might be no direct match. That was precisely the situation investigators faced. The Golden State Killer's DNA existed, but the man himself did not exist in the database. For decades, that limitation protected him. Then the science of genealogy began changing the investigative landscape. Consumer DNA testing created enormous databases of genetic information voluntarily submitted by people interested in ancestry and family connection. These databases were not originally designed to identify criminals, but investigators realized that genetic relationships could reveal something traditional forensic databases could not: relatives. A crime scene DNA profile did not have to match the suspect directly. It might match a distant relative. That relative could reveal a family branch. The family branch could lead to another generation. Researchers could then construct a genealogical tree and identify individuals who fit the remaining characteristics of the unknown offender. This approach was revolutionary because it changed the question investigators were asked. They were no longer asking, "Who is this DNA?" They were asking, "Whose family could this DNA belong to?" That was a much larger question, but it was also one that modern genetic genealogy could answer. The Golden State Killer investigation became one of the most famous examples of this new approach. Investigators took the DNA profile associated with the crimes and used it to search a genealogy database. The search produced distant relatives rather than a direct suspect. For investigators, this was the beginning of a painstaking process. The relatives were not accused of anything. Their genetic information simply suggested that they shared ancestry with the unknown offender. Investigators and genealogists had to trace those relationships backward and forward through generations. They examined family trees, marriage records, birth records, obituaries, and other sources. They identified common ancestors and built branches. Then they began eliminating people who could not fit. Some were too old. Some were too young, some were the wrong sex, some lived in places inconsistent with the known crimes. The family tree gradually became narrower. The process was not like searching a computer for a name and receiving an answer. It was closer to reconstructing a massive puzzle where the image was incomplete. Every genealogical connection created another possibility, and every confirmed relationship helped eliminate others. The investigators eventually reached a family line that led toward Joseph James D'Angelo. But even then, genealogy did not establish guilt. It identified a potential suspect. That distinction was critical. Investigators had to confirm the lead independently. They began surveillance. They watched D'Angelo. They looked for opportunities to collect his DNA without alerting him. The goal was simple: obtain a biological sample that could be compared with the crime scene profile. The opportunity came when investigators recovered discarded DNA material connected to D'Angelo. The sample was tested. The result was decisive. It matched the DNA associated with the Golden State Killer crime. The genetic profile that had remained unidentified for decades now had a name: Joseph James D'Angelo. On April 24, 2018, investigators arrested him at his home in Citrus Heights. The image of the arrest was extraordinary because it represented the collapse of a mystery that had endured for more than 4 decades. A case that had begun in the 1970s had finally reached the present. Investigators had spent years searching for a stranger. The stranger had turned out to be a man who had lived an ordinary public life. The revelation sent shock waves through California and far beyond. The arrest also demonstrated how dramatically forensic science had changed. In the 1970s, investigators could collect biological evidence, but the ability to analyze and compare DNA was still developing. In the 1980s and 1990s, forensic DNA became increasingly powerful, yet the case still lacked a direct match. By the 2000s, investigators had a strong genetic profile, but no name. Then genetic genealogy created an entirely new path. The evidence itself had not necessarily changed. The method of interpreting it had. This distinction is important because it explains why the killer could remain unidentified for so long. The investigators of the 1970s were not necessarily looking at evidence that was useless. They were looking at evidence that technology could not yet exploit in the way later investigators could. The DNA had been there. The answer had been hidden inside it. Science simply needed decades to develop the tools required to uncover it. The arrest also forced victims to confront the possibility that the man they had feared for decades was finally within reach of the justice system. For survivors, the news could produce conflicting emotions: relief, anger, shock, disbelief. Some had spent decades wondering whether they would ever know the identity of their attacker. Others had built lives around trying not to think about the crimes. Suddenly, the past had returned to them with a name and a fate. For families of murder victims, the impact was even more profound. Their loved ones had been killed decades earlier. The families had lived with unanswered questions and the knowledge that the person responsible remained unidentified. Now they were learning that the killer had been living among the public for years. The arrest could not change the past, but it could change the future of the case. Prosecutors now had an identifiable defendant. Investigators could connect individual crimes to a specific person. The courtroom could finally become the place where the evidence would be presented. But before that could happen, the prosecution had to understand exactly how much evidence existed and which crimes could be proven beyond a reasonable doubt. The Golden State Killer case involved numerous victims across multiple decades and jurisdictions. Investigators had to reconstruct the history carefully. They had to distinguish confirmed evidence from older investigative theories. They had to ensure that charges were supported by admissible evidence. And they had to prepare for a defense that would undoubtedly examine every weakness. The arrest was therefore not the end of the investigation. It was the beginning of a new phase. The cold case had become a prosecution. The investigators now had to transform decades of evidence into a courtroom case. That meant revisiting crime scenes through old reports, reviewing witness statements, examining DNA evidence, and identifying which murders and assaults could be legally connected to D'Angelo. The challenge was enormous because the crimes had occurred over many years. Different police agencies had investigated them. Some evidence had been collected decades earlier. Some witnesses had aged. Some had died. The passage of time created obstacles at every step. Yet the central piece of evidence remained extraordinarily powerful. DNA had linked D'Angelo to the crimes. The genealogy had led investigators to him. The independent DNA comparison had confirmed the identification. The case now had something it had lacked since the beginning: a suspect whose biological signature matched the evidence. The man who had once existed only as a terrifying unknown was now standing in front of investigators as a living defendant. And the story that had begun with mysterious nighttime attacks was moving toward a courtroom where decades of secrets would finally be confronted. The Golden State Killer had been caught, but the full truth of what happened during those years had only begun to emerge. The arrest of Joseph James D'Angelo transformed the Golden State Killer investigation from a decades-old mystery into an active criminal prosecution. But investigators still faced a staggering task: proving the full extent of the crimes attributed to him and presenting a case that could withstand the passage of time. For more than 40 years, the investigation had been divided across jurisdictions, generations of detectives, and different names for the same unknown offender. Now those scattered pieces had to be brought together. The man who had once been described only through sketches and eyewitness memories had finally been identified through DNA. But identification was only the beginning. Prosecutors had to establish what he had done, where he had done it, and which crimes could be directly tied to him beyond reasonable doubt. The answer would come through a combination of old evidence, witness accounts, forensic records, and the extraordinary DNA profile that had survived from the original investigation. The crimes attributed to D'Angelo stretched across California and over more than a decade. In the earliest period, investigators were dealing with an offender who would eventually become known as the East Area Rapist. He targeted homes, entered at night, and attacked victims in circumstances designed to leave them isolated and vulnerable. The offender was not simply committing spontaneous crime. Investigators believed he studied neighborhoods and routines, learning enough about his targets to exploit moments when they were least prepared to defend themselves. The attacks generated fear across communities in Northern California. People changed the way they locked doors. Neighborhoods became suspicious of unfamiliar vehicles and strange noises. Parents worried about their children. Residents wondered whether the person living nearby could somehow be connected to the crime. The fear was intensified by the fact that police could not tell the public exactly who they were looking for. They had descriptions, but descriptions are imperfect. They had evidence, but the evidence could not produce a name. They had victims, but the offender remained invisible. The investigation expanded as more attacks were reported. Detectives compared cases and recognized similarities. The same type of entry, similar behavior, similar methods of controlling victims, similar evidence left behind. The pattern became increasingly difficult to dismiss as coincidence. Yet even as investigators began to understand the offender, they remained unable to identify him. That problem continued when the crimes moved south. In Southern California, murders were linked to a figure investigators called the original Night Stalker. The name reflected a different phase of the investigation here. The offender was no longer known only for sexual assault. The crimes included homicides, and the level of violence increased the urgency of the search. Investigators in Northern and Southern California eventually recognized that the two crime series were connected. The East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker were the same man. The realization was enormous. It meant that a single offender had terrorized different communities across a vast geographic area and had remained unidentified despite the work of numerous law enforcement agencies. The case became one of the largest unsolved investigations in California. Detectives pursued leads. Tips came in. Suspects were considered and eliminated. Years passed. The killer remained free. Then the science of DNA changed the investigation. Biological evidence collected from some of the crimes allowed investigators to create a genetic profile. That profile established a crucial connection among crimes committed years and hundreds of miles apart. It showed that the same unknown male was responsible. For investigators, the DNA was a breakthrough, but it was also a frustration. They knew more about the killer biologically than they knew about him personally. They could say with confidence that the same genetic profile appeared in evidence connected to the crime, but they could not say who the man was. The traditional forensic databases did not provide the answer. The profile did not match a known offender. The killer remained a biological identity without a name. That limitation persisted until investigative genetic genealogy changed the possibility. When investigators searched the crime scene DNA through a genealogy database, they did not receive an immediate identification. Instead, they received distant genetic relatives. To understand why that mattered, imagine an enormous family tree with thousands of branches. The killer was somewhere inside it, but investigators did not know where. A distant cousin could reveal a branch. Another relative could reveal another. Researchers could trace common ancestors backward, then move forward through descendants. With enough relationships, the unknown individual could eventually be narrowed down. This was the heart of the breakthrough. Investigators did not need a direct genetic match. They needed enough relatives to build a path toward the offender. The process required specialized genealogical research. Investigators worked with genetic genealogists who could interpret the relationships revealed by the DNA database. They examined family structures and historical records. They looked for individuals who fit the biological and demographic characteristics of the unknown offender. Slowly, the enormous universe of possible people became small. Eventually, the investigation reached a family line that pointed toward Joseph James D'Angelo. But investigators understood that the genealogical lead was only a lead. It could not be presented as proof by itself. A relative of the killer could share DNA with many people. Investigators needed to demonstrate that D'Angelo himself was the source of the crime scene DNA. That meant surveillance and independent biological testing. Detectives began watching D'Angelo, who was living in Citrus Heights. He was not behaving like a man who believed he was about to become the center of one of the most important criminal investigations in California history. He had lived for decades beyond the reach of investigators. He had family. He had a home. He had a past career in law enforcement. The investigators watched carefully because one mistake could alert him and destroy the opportunity to obtain a clean comparison sample. Eventually, they collected discarded DNA material. The sample was tested against the crime scene profile. The result was a match. The man who had been unknown for more than 40 years had been identified. On April 24th, SIL 2018, D'Angelo was arrested at his home. The image of the arrest carried a strange sense of unreality. The killer had been hunted for decades, yet he was now an elderly man being taken into custody from an ordinary suburban residence. For the investigators involved, the moment represented the end of one investigation and the beginning of another. The mystery of identity had been solved. The question of accountability remained. The prosecution began assembling the evidence. Investigators revisited the crimes attributed to the Golden State Killer and determined which charges could be supported. The sheer number of victims made the process complex. The case involved sexual assaults, robberies, kidnappings, and murders across multiple counties. Prosecutors had to work with local law enforcement agencies to reconstruct the history of each crime. The passage of time made this difficult. Some original investigators were no longer available. Some witnesses had aged. Some evidence had been stored for decades. Some memories had changed. But the case also contained something extraordinarily rare: biological evidence that directly connected the defendant to the crimes. DNA does not tell a story by itself. It does not explain motive. It does not describe what happened inside a house, but it can establish a biological connection between a person and evidence. In this case, that connection became the foundation of the prosecution. The genealogy had identified D'Angelo as a potential suspect. The independent DNA comparison confirmed him as the source of the biological evidence. Together, those methods produced what traditional investigators had been unable to obtain for decades: an identity. The prosecution then faced another challenge. D'Angelo's defense could argue that the crimes were too old, that memories were unreliable, that evidence had been preserved for too long, or that specific charges could not be proved. Prosecutors therefore had to be precise. They could not simply rely on the legend of the Golden State Killer. They had to present evidence connected to individual crimes. Each victim mattered. Each crime scene mattered. Each piece of evidence mattered. The case had to move from the terrifying reputation of an unknown predator to legally provable acts committed by a named defendant. That process required the survivors to revisit experiences many had spent decades trying to leave behind. Some victims had never known who attacked them. Some had lived with the fear that he might return. Others had spent years wondering whether their memories would ever be validated. The arrest brought the possibility of answers, but it also brought painful memories back into focus. The courtroom would become the place where those memories and the forensic evidence intersected. The prosecution eventually charged D'Angelo with multiple counts of murder and kidnapping. The charges focused on murders and other crimes for which prosecutors had sufficient evidence. The case was vast, but the strategy was clear. Use the strongest evidence to establish responsibility and avoid allowing the age of the crimes to overwhelm the facts. DNA would remain central. So would the testimony and recollections of survivors. The prosecution would also rely on the historical record developed over decades. The old investigation was not discarded. It became part of the foundation of the new one. In that sense, the arrest did not replace the original detectives. It completed their work. The investigators of the 1970s and 1980s had collected evidence that later generations could finally exploit. The detectives of the 2010s had technology that earlier investigators could not have imagined. Neither group could have solved the case alone. The final breakthrough was the product of time, preservation, and changing science. It was also a reminder that forensic technology is only as powerful as the evidence preserved for it. If the biological evidence had been lost, the genetic genealogy breakthrough might never have happened. If the old reports had disappeared, the genealogical lead might have been harder to verify. If investigators had not continued looking for new methods, the DNA profile might have remained unidentified indefinitely. Instead, decades-old evidence became the key to a modern investigation. The arrest also changed the public understanding of the case. For years, the Golden State Killer had been treated almost like a goat. He had become a symbol of the perfect cold case predator, the man who could attack and disappear without being caught. But the DNA breakthrough shattered that image. He was not supernatural. He was not invisible. He was a human being whose biological evidence had remained behind. His apparent ability to evade police had depended partly on the limitations of the technology available at the time. Once those limitations changed, his anonymity became fragile. The genealogy search did not magically solve the case. It created a path. Investigators still had to follow that path carefully and prove the result. But the path existed, and once investigators reached D'Angelo, the final DNA comparison ended the uncertainty. The arrest, therefore, became one of the defining moments in modern cold case investigation. It demonstrated that a case can remain dormant for decades and then suddenly move at extraordinary speed when a new technology changes what investigators can do. The Golden State Killer had spent more than 40 years beyond the reach of a direct identification. Then, within months, investigators had a suspect, a DNA match, and an arrest. The transformation was almost impossible to comprehend. A mystery that had once seemed permanent suddenly had an answer. But for the survivors, the arrest was not merely a scientific triumph. It was personal. It meant the man who had haunted their memories was finally known. It meant they could stop asking whether he was still somewhere in the world. It meant the police finally knew who had entered their homes, attacked their families, and killed people they loved. Yet knowing his name could not erase the years of uncertainty. It could only change what came next. The prosecution would now have to confront the full history of the Golden State Killer. The courtroom would become the stage where decades of evidence would be assembled, and the victims, some of whom had waited more than 40 years, would finally have an opportunity to see the man they had feared face the consequences of what investigators said he had done. The DNA had solved the mystery of identity. Now justice had to answer the larger question. What punishment could ever match a crime spree that had stretched across decades and left so many lives permanently changed? The answer would emerge slowly, through the evidence, the victim, and a courtroom forced to look backward across more than 40 years of California history. The killer had finally been caught, but the most difficult chapter was still ahead. The courtroom phase of the Golden State Killer case forced a crime spree that had once seemed almost too large to comprehend into a sequence of individual victims, individual homes, individual nights, and individual acts of violence. For decades, the offender had been described through a collection of names and theories. Now the prosecution had a defendant sitting before the court. Joseph James D'Angelo was no longer an unidentified figure in a police sketch. He was a living man facing the consequences of crimes that had begun more than 40 years earlier, but identifying him was only one part of the prosecution. The next challenge was proving what he had done and demonstrating the connection between the defendant and the crimes that had terrified California for years. The evidence was extensive, but the passage of time created unusual complications. Investigators had to return to reports written decades earlier, examine physical evidence that had been preserved for years, and reconnect with survivors whose lives had continued long after their encounters with the offender. The case, therefore, became more than a forensic investigation. It became an effort to reconstruct a vanished world. The crimes had taken place in neighborhoods that had changed, houses that had changed hands, and communities that had grown older. Yet the evidence still carried the imprint of what had happened. DNA remained the strongest scientific link. The same biological evidence that had once been unable to produce a name now connected D'Angelo to the crime. Investigators had followed genetic genealogy from distant relatives to a family tree and then to a specific suspect. The final comparison with discarded DNA had confirmed the identification. That evidence gave prosecutors something investigators in the 1970s could never have possessed: a direct biological connection between the unknown offender and Joseph D'Angelo. But DNA alone could not tell the whole story. The prosecution also needed to establish the circumstances of individual crimes. That meant returning to the survivor. For many of them, the passage of time had not erased the memory of what happened. It had simply forced them to live with it. Some had spent decades without knowing the attacker's identity. Some had feared that the person who entered their home might still be somewhere nearby. Some had built families and careers while carrying memories that could not simply be discarded. The arrest forced those memories back into public view. Suddenly, a man they had once known only as an anonymous predator had a name: Joseph James D'Angelo. The realization was both relieving and disturbing. The person responsible was finally identified, but the identity was attached to a man who had spent decades living an apparently ordinary life. That contrast became one of the most unsettling aspects of the case. The Golden State Killer had not vanished from the world. He had aged. He had lived in California. He had raised a family. He had worked and eventually retired. He had been surrounded by ordinary routines while investigators continued searching for the person responsible for crimes committed decades earlier. The arrest shattered the illusion that the killer was somehow unreachable. He had been living in the same world as everyone else. The prosecution then began narrowing the enormous number of crimes into charges that could be presented in court. Authorities had identified D'Angelo as the offender responsible for a broad series of crimes, but the formal case focused on specific murders and kidnappings for which evidence could support prosecution. The charges included multiple counts of first-degree murder and kidnapping. Each charge represented an individual human tragedy. The legal process could not simply say that D'Angelo was the Golden State Killer and therefore responsible for everything attributed to that name. Prosecutors had to establish each charge through evidence. That meant presenting the facts of the murders, connecting D'Angelo to the scenes, and showing the jury how the DNA and other evidence fit together. The case eventually centered on 13 murders and numerous kidnappings. The murders had occurred in Northern and Southern California over a period of years. The victims were not statistics. They were couples, parents, sons, daughters, neighbors, and friends. Each murder had created a family with an empty chair and an unanswered question. Some families had spent decades wondering whether the person responsible would ever be identified. The prosecution's case therefore carried the weight of many separate tragedies. The courtroom was not simply about one defendant. It was about the consequences of a long series of crimes. One of the most important aspects of the prosecution was the use of the defendant's own words. D'Angelo eventually admitted responsibility for the murders as part of a plea agreement. His admission spared the victims and their families from a lengthy trial that could have required them to testify and relive the details of the crimes in open court. The decision to accept a plea was therefore not merely a legal calculation. It was also a recognition of the emotional cost that a full trial could impose on survivors and families. Prosecutors had to balance the desire for the maximum possible punishment against the reality that many victims had already spent decades carrying the trauma. The plea agreement would provide certainty. It would also guarantee a severe sentence, but before that agreement was reached, the case had to be developed carefully. Prosecutors knew that D'Angelo had a long history of avoiding identification. They could not afford to treat the case casually. The evidence had to be organized in a way that could withstand scrutiny. DNA evidence was particularly important because it provided a scientific link independent of memory. Witnesses can forget. Human recollection changes, but a properly preserved biological sample can remain stable for decades. That was one reason the old evidence became so valuable. The crime scenes had left behind information that investigators could still use. The technology had changed, but the evidence remained. The genetic genealogy breakthrough also became a major symbol of the investigation. It showed that a criminal could remain unidentified even while leaving behind a biological signature capable of identifying him years later. The Golden State Killer had spent decades benefiting from the limitations of conventional databases. He was not found because his DNA suddenly changed. He was found because investigators learned how to interpret the genetic relationships hidden within the DNA. That difference was revolutionary. Traditional forensic searches ask whether a crime scene sample matches someone already known to the system. Genetic genealogy can ask whether the sample is related to someone in a genealogical database. That means investigators can potentially identify suspects who have never been arrested and whose DNA is not stored in conventional criminal databases. The Golden State Killer became the case that demonstrated the extraordinary power of this approach to the public. But the legal process also raised questions about privacy and the use of genetic information. Consumer genealogy databases were created primarily for personal ancestry research. The use of those databases for criminal investigations created a new debate. What rights should individuals have over genetic information shared by themselves or relatives? How far should investigators be allowed to trace family relationships? What rules should govern the use of genealogical databases in serious crime? These questions became increasingly important as genetic genealogy spread to other cold cases. The Golden State Killer investigation showed what was possible, but it also forced society to confront the consequences of that possibility. The science had moved faster than many legal and ethical frameworks. Investigators had discovered a powerful tool. Regulators and courts now had to consider how that tool should be controlled. For the victims, however, the immediate issue was simpler. They wanted answers. They wanted accountability. Many had lived with uncertainty for most of their adult lives. The arrest finally gave them something that had seemed impossible: the opportunity to see their attacker face justice. Some survivors had been teenagers or young adults when the crimes occurred. By the time D'Angelo was arrested, they were older. Some were grandparents. Their lives had continued, but the memories had remained. The case had become part of their personal history. The arrest brought that history into the present. In court, prosecutors emphasized the human impact of the crimes. The defendants' actions had not ended when the attacks stopped. The psychological consequences continued. Families changed. Victims carried trauma. Communities had been altered by fear. The Golden State Killer had created a legacy that extended far beyond the crime scenes. His eventual identification, therefore, carried significance not only as a forensic achievement, but also as a form of recognition for those who had waited for decades. The prosecution eventually reached a plea agreement in which D'Angelo admitted responsibility for 13 murders and admitted to numerous other crimes. In exchange, prosecutors agreed not to pursue the death penalty. The plea resolved the case without the need for a lengthy jury trial. It also meant that the families would not have to sit through months of evidence describing crimes that had already shaped their lives for decades. D'Angelo entered his plea in 2020. The courtroom became the place where the unknown predator was finally confronted as an identified defendant. His admission removed the final uncertainty over whether he was responsible for the crimes charged. The man who had once been known only by frightening nicknames now stood before the court under his real name, Joseph James D'Angelo. The moment carried an almost surreal sense of history. More than 4 decades had passed since the first attack. Investigators from the original era were now elderly or retired. Some had died. Victims had aged. Families had changed. Yet the case had survived. The evidence had survived. And eventually, the killer himself had been brought before a judge. The sentence that followed was extraordinarily severe. D'Angelo received multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, along with additional years for other offenses. The punishment ensured that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. For the families, the sentence represented accountability, but not restoration. Nothing could restore the people who had been killed. Nothing could erase the fear experienced by survivors. Nothing could return the decades lost to uncertainty. But the sentence established a final legal fact. Joseph James D'Angelo would never again be a free man. The case that had once seemed impossible to solve was finally closed in the courtroom. Yet the story of how it reached that point remained extraordinary. A biological sample collected decades earlier became a genetic profile. The profile became a genealogical search. The search became a family tree. The family tree produced a suspect. Surveillance produced a discarded DNA sample. The sample produced a match. The match produced an arrest. And the arrest ultimately produced a guilty plea and life imprisonment. Each step depended on the one before it. Remove any link, and the outcome might have been different. That chain of events changed cold case investigations around the world. Suddenly, detectives could look at old DNA evidence in a completely new way. A case without a direct database match was no longer necessarily a case without a path forward. Investigators could ask whether the unknown DNA belonged to someone connected to a family represented in a genealogy database. The approach had limitations and required careful safeguards, but its potential was undeniable. The Golden State Killer investigation had become a landmark. It showed that the past could be reopened by science. It showed that evidence preserved decades earlier could become more powerful with time rather than less. And it showed that a person could lie for decades believing that the crimes were behind him, only to discover that the biological evidence had never forgotten. The killer had disappeared from the headlines. But his DNA had remained, and when investigators finally learned how to follow it, the silence ended. The courtroom did not erase the crime. It did something different. It gave the crimes a legal conclusion. It gave victims an identified offender. It gave families an answer, and it transformed Joseph James DeAngelo from a faceless figure in one of California's darkest cold cases into a convicted murderer serving the rest of his life behind bars. The man who had once seemed impossible to catch had finally been found. The DNA had done what decades of conventional investigation could not. It had exposed the identity hidden inside the evidence, and the secret that had survived for more than 40 years was finally out in the open. The most powerful evidence in the Golden State Killer case had been waiting quietly for decades, preserved from a time when investigators could not have imagined what forensic science would eventually become. It was not a confession written on paper. It was not a hidden photograph. It was not a witness who suddenly remembered a forgotten fate. It was biological evidence, microscopic traces left behind at crime scenes that investigators had collected when the technology available to them was still developing for decades. That evidence could tell investigators only part of the story. It could establish connections between crimes. It could identify an unknown male profile. It could help exclude suspects. But it could not tell detectives the name of the man who had left it behind. That limitation became one of the defining frustrations of the case. Investigators knew the offender's genetic identity long before they knew his actual identity. They possessed something that seemed incredibly precise, yet it stopped just short of the answer they needed. The DNA profile was essentially a fingerprint written in biology, but there was no name attached to it. Traditional forensic databases were built around direct comparison. If a crime scene DNA profile matched a person whose DNA was already stored in the system, investigators could potentially identify that person. But if the offender had never provided a qualifying sample, the database would return nothing. That was the situation with the Golden State Killer. His DNA was strong evidence, but the databases did not contain the direct match. For years, the case remained trapped inside that limitation. Then, a new field began to emerge, changing the question investigators could ask. Genetic genealogy took information about genetic relationships and used it to reconstruct family connection. Instead of searching for the offender himself, investigators could search for relatives. That difference sounds small, but in a cold case, it can be enormous. A person can avoid a criminal DNA database. A person cannot necessarily escape the genetic relationships shared with relatives. Every individual carries DNA inherited through generations. Even distant cousins can share enough genetic material to reveal a connection. If investigators could identify one or more distant relatives of an unknown offender, they could potentially work backward toward common ancestors and then forward through descendants until they reached a plausible suspect. It was a new way of thinking about forensic evidence. The crime scene no longer had to point directly to the killer, it could point toward his family. In the Golden State Killer investigation, that approach became the key. Investigators took the crime scene DNA profile and uploaded it to a genealogy database that could be used for this type of analysis. The results did not produce Joseph DeAngelo's name immediately. Instead, they revealed genetic relationships to people who were not suspected of any crime. Those individuals became the first branches of a massive genealogical investigation. Genealogists began tracing their family histories. They searched for common ancestors. They constructed family trees. They identified descendants. Then they began narrowing the possibility. The process required enormous patience because a genetic relationship alone does not identify a criminal. A distant cousin could be connected to thousands of people through a shared ancestral line. Investigators had to reconstruct those lines carefully. They had to determine which branches were relevant and which were not. They had to consider age, geography, sex, and other known characteristics of the offender. Slowly, the possible universe became smaller. Eventually, the investigation pointed toward the family of Joseph James D'Angelo. But the genealogical discovery was not enough. This was one of the most important safeguards in the investigation. Genetic genealogy could identify a person as a possible suspect, but investigators still needed direct evidence linking that individual to the crime. They could not simply arrest someone because a relative appeared in a genealogy database. The final identification had to come from a direct DNA comparison. That meant investigators needed a biological sample from D'Angelo himself. The surveillance phase began. Investigators watched his movements and waited for an opportunity to collect DNA without alerting him. The objective was simple, but critical. They needed a sample that could be compared with the DNA preserved from the original crime scene. Eventually, investigators obtained discarded biological material associated with D'Angelo. Laboratory testing produced the answer they were looking for. The DNA matched. The genetic evidence from the crimes was connected directly to Joseph James D'Angelo. The man who had remained unidentified for more than 40 years had finally been named through a combination of genealogy and conventional forensic science. This was the moment when the cold case truly broke open. The genealogical research had provided the direction. The direct DNA comparison provided the confirmation. Together, they transformed a decades-old biological profile into a prosecutable suspect. The arrest followed quickly on April 24th. Still 2018, authorities took D'Angelo into custody at his home in Citrus Heights. For investigators who had spent years working on the case, the arrest represented an extraordinary culmination. For victims, it was something even more profound. The person they had remembered for decades was no longer an unknown figure. The man who had entered their homes and terrorized their lives had a name. For families of murder victims, the news carried a different kind of weight. Their loved ones were gone, but the question of who had killed them had finally been answered. The arrest also demonstrated the power of preserving evidence. The DNA used to identify D'Angelo had been collected from crimes that occurred decades earlier. In ordinary circumstances, evidence can deteriorate, disappear, or become contaminated. But when biological evidence is preserved properly, it can remain useful for an extraordinary length of time. The Golden State Killer case showed why old evidence should not automatically be considered obsolete. Scientific technology evolved. A sample that cannot answer a question today may answer it years later when a new analytical method becomes available. The case, therefore, became a lesson for law enforcement agencies around the world. Cold case evidence should be protected because investigators cannot know what future science will make possible. The same principle applies beyond DNA. Fingerprints, photographs, documents, digital records, witness statements, and physical objects can all acquire new value when investigative techniques change. The Golden State Killer investigation was particularly powerful because the evidence had survived long enough for genetic genealogy to emerge. Without the original DNA, the genealogy method would have had nothing to analyze. Without careful preservation, the decades-old profile might never have produced the breakthrough. The investigation was therefore a chain connecting generations of forensic work. Detectives from the original cases had collected evidence without knowing whether it would ever identify the offender. Later, investigators inherited that evidence and recognized that technology had finally caught up with it. The result was a scientific bridge across 40 years, yet the case also revealed the complexity of genetic genealogy. DNA is deeply personal. Unlike a fingerprint, which identifies one person, genetic information can reveal relationships between many people. A genealogy search can potentially expose information about relatives who never submitted their own DNA. That reality raised serious privacy concerns. The Golden State Killer investigation became a landmark not only because it solved a notorious case, but because it demonstrated the investigative power of consumer genetic databases. After the arrest, law enforcement agencies and policymakers began examining how such techniques should be used. Questions emerged about consent, database policies, warrants, oversight, and the boundaries of investigative genealogy. The technology could help solve serious crimes, but its use required rules. The case had opened a door that could not easily be closed. Investigators around the world began wondering whether other unidentified killers might also be hiding inside old DNA profiles. The answer was yes. Genetic genealogy soon became a powerful tool in cold case investigations, especially when traditional DNA databases had failed to produce a match. But the Golden State Killer remained the case that introduced the method to a massive global audience. It demonstrated the basic logic in a way the public could understand. The killer's DNA was known. His name was not. Investigators found relatives. They built the family tree. They narrowed the possibilities. Then they obtained his DNA and confirmed the match. The mystery collapsed. The technology did not read the killer's name from the DNA. It used relationships to create a path toward him. That distinction mattered because it explained why the method was so innovative. Traditional forensic science often searches for direct matches. Genetic genealogy searches for biological connections. One looks for the person. The other can look for the family. In the Golden State Killer investigation, the family became the map, and the map led to D'Angelo. For decades, the killer had benefited from anonymity. His crimes were known, but his identity was not. He had been described through physical characteristics, behavior, and crime scene evidence. He had been given terrifying nicknames. But a nickname is not a person. The arrest changed that. The Golden State Killer was no longer a legend. He was Joseph James D'Angelo, a former police officer and California resident whose DNA matched the evidence. The discovery was disturbing partly because of the apparent normality surrounding him. The public had imagined a mysterious predator hiding somewhere in the shadow. Instead, investigators found an aging man living a life that appeared ordinary on the surface. The contrast forced many people to reconsider how they understood unsolved crime. The absence of suspicion does not mean the absence of evidence. A person can appear ordinary while carrying a secret for decades. But biological evidence does not depend on appearances. DNA does not care whether someone has a family, a job, a home, or a respectable public image. If the biological evidence matches, the connection remains. That was the power of the evidence that finally brought D'Angelo into custody. The arrest did not depend on a dramatic confrontation in a dark alley. It did not depend on a killer suddenly confessing everything. It began with science. It continued through genealogy. It was confirmed by DNA. And it ended with police officers arriving at an ordinary home to arrest a man who had spent more than 40 years beyond the reach of investigators. For the victims, however, the scientific breakthrough was only meaningful because it produced accountability. A DNA match is powerful, but a family waiting for justice needs more than laboratory results. They need a legal conclusion. They need the system to recognize what happened. They need the offender to face consequences. That process was now beginning. The investigation had solved the mystery of identity. The next question was what would happen in court. D'Angelo had been caught because the evidence finally connected his past to his present. But the courtroom would force that connection into the public record. Decades of crimes would be examined. Survivors would confront the reality of the man who had terrorized them. Families would hear the details of murders that had haunted them for generations, and the defendant would eventually have to answer for the crimes that had remained unresolved for so long. The DNA had opened the door. Now the justice system would have to walk through it. The courtroom could now do something the investigators of the 1970s had once believed might never happen. Place Joseph James D'Angelo before a judge and force the decades-old crimes into the present. For more than 40 years, the Golden State Killer had existed as an unanswered question. Now the question had become a criminal case. The arrest in April 2018 had stunned California, but the legal process that followed was enormous. Investigators had identified D'Angelo through genetic genealogy and confirmed the identification through direct DNA evidence. Prosecutors now had to determine how to present a crime spree that had crossed jurisdictions, involved numerous victims, and stretched back to a period when many of the people connected to the investigation had lived completely different lives. The passage of time was everywhere. The victims were older. Investigators had retired. Records had been stored for decades. Some witnesses were no longer alive. Some families had spent most of their lives believing they might never know who was responsible. Yet the evidence had survived, and so had the memory. When D'Angelo first appeared in court, the image was radically different from the one investigators had imagined during the original manhunt. The man they had searched for had once been described as a physically imposing predator capable of moving through neighborhoods at night without being caught. Now he was an elderly defendant. His hair was white. His body had aged. His face belonged to a man who had lived through the same decades as the people he had terrorized. That contrast was difficult for many observers to process. The Golden State Killer had become almost mythical during the years when his identity remained unknown. The arrest reduced the myth to a human being standing before a court. But the crimes themselves remained anything but ordinary. Prosecutors alleged that D'Angelo was responsible for a series of sexual assaults, kidnappings, robberies, and murders committed in California between 1975 and 1986. The crimes had begun in Northern California, where the offender became known as the East Area Rapist. Later, he was connected to murders in Southern California, where he became known as the original Night Stalker. For years, investigators did not know that these names referred to the same man. The realization that the two crime series were connected dramatically expanded the scope of the investigation. The killer had not been a local predator confined to one neighborhood. He had moved through different communities and left victims behind across a wide geographic area. His ability to remain unidentified became one of the most disturbing features of the case. He had operated during a period when forensic technology was far less advanced than it is today. DNA profiling was not yet available when the earliest attacks occurred. Investigators relied on fingerprints, physical descriptions, witness accounts, photographs, sketches, behavioral patterns, and traditional police work. They collected biological evidence, but the scientific tools needed to exploit that evidence would not become available until later. That historical context mattered. The original investigators were not ignoring DNA evidence because they lacked interest in it. The technology simply had not reached the point where it could transform biological material into an identification. When forensic DNA analysis eventually became available, it allowed investigators to establish that the same unknown male was connected to multiple crimes. That was an enormous breakthrough, but it still did not provide a name. The offender remained unidentified. The case, therefore, entered another phase of waiting. The DNA profile became a kind of silent witness. It could say that the same person was present at different crime scenes. It could distinguish the killer from innocent suspects. It could confirm or eliminate theories, but it could not tell investigators where the man lived. It could not tell them what he did for a living. It could not reveal that he had once been a police officer. It could not provide his name. That changed only when investigators turned to genetic genealogy. The genealogy search created a path through distant relatives, but the final identification still depended on conventional investigative work. This combination was important. Genetic genealogy did not replace detectives. It gave them a direction. Once the family tree pointed toward D'Angelo, investigators still had to conduct surveillance and obtain a direct DNA sample. The discarded DNA sample produced the confirmation. That confirmation transformed the genealogical theory into forensic evidence. The arrest followed. The prosecution now possessed a powerful narrative supported by science. An unknown offender had left DNA at crime scenes. That DNA had been used to identify distant relatives. Genealogical research had narrowed the possibilities. D'Angelo had emerged as a suspect. His discarded DNA matched the crime scene profile, and he had been arrested. But prosecutors still had to confront the human side of the case. Every count represented a victim. Every murder charge represented a family that had lived with loss. Every kidnapping charge represented a survivor who had endured an experience that could not be undone. The courtroom would eventually bring many of those stories together. For some victims, the legal process offered a chance to speak publicly after decades of silence. For others, simply knowing the attacker had been identified was enough to change the emotional weight of the past. The case also demonstrated how differently victims can experience the same legal development. One survivor might feel relief, another might feel anger, another might feel fear returning after decades. Another might simply feel exhausted. The arrest was not the end of the trauma. It was a new stage of confronting it. Prosecutors, therefore, had to consider the victims not only as witnesses, but as people whose lives had been permanently altered. A conventional trial could require testimony about deeply personal events. It could require survivors to sit in the same courtroom as the man accused of attacking them. It could force them to describe details they had spent decades trying to put behind them. That reality would become important when prosecutors and defense attorneys eventually negotiated a plea agreement. Before that agreement, however, the legal case continued to develop. D'Angelo faced charges involving multiple murders and kidnapping. Prosecutors in several California counties worked together because the crimes had occurred across jurisdictions. The case required cooperation among agencies that had once investigated different portions of the mystery. The old division between the East Area Rapist and original Night Stalker investigations had become irrelevant. The prosecution now treated them as parts of one enormous criminal history. Evidence collected decades apart could be considered together. DNA linked the crimes. Historical investigative records showed patterns. Witnesses provided account. The defendant's identity was no longer in doubt. The challenge was transforming that information into a legally sustainable case. The prosecution eventually determined that a plea agreement would serve the interests of justice while sparing victims and families from a prolonged trial. In June 2020, D'Angelo pleaded guilty to 13 counts of first-degree murder and admitted to numerous additional crimes. He also admitted to 13 kidnappings for robbery. The plea was a stunning moment because the man who had spent decades as an unidentified predator was finally acknowledging responsibility in court. The agreement allowed prosecutors to seek multiple life sentences without parole rather than pursue the death penalty. It also meant the families would not have to endure a lengthy trial. The decision was significant because a trial could have lasted months and required survivors to testify about crimes committed decades earlier. A guilty plea provided certainty. There would be no jury deliberation over whether D'Angelo was responsible for the charged murders. There would be no possibility of an acquittal on the central question. His own plea established the legal outcome, but the courtroom proceedings did something else. They gave victims an opportunity to speak. During the sentencing hearings, survivors and relatives of victims confronted D'Angelo directly. Their statements became one of the most emotionally powerful parts of the entire case. Some described the fear that had remained with them for decades. Others spoke about how the crimes had affected their relationships, their families, their sense of security, and their ability to live normally. The passage of time had not erased the consequences. The attacks might have ended in the 1970s or 1980s, but their psychological impact continued into the 21st century. This was one of the most important truths revealed by the case. A cold case does not mean the consequences are cold. The evidence may sit untouched in a box, but the people affected by the crime continue living with it. A victim who was 20 years old when attacked may be 60 years old when the perpetrator is arrested. A child who lost a parent may become a grandparent before learning who was responsible. A family may spend decades marking birthdays and anniversaries without answers. The calendar moves forward. Trauma does not always move at the same speed. For many victims, D'Angelo's arrest was therefore not simply a police achievement. It was a moment when the past collided with the present. The man who had once controlled their lives through fear was finally under the control of the justice system. During the sentencing proceedings, D'Angelo made an unusual statement in which he described an internal force that he said had driven him to commit the crime. The statement was widely reported because it represented one of the few times the defendant publicly addressed his conduct. But for victims, explanations were less important than accountability. Whatever D'Angelo believed about his actions could not change the consequences. The people he killed were still dead. The people he assaulted still carried memories. Families still carried grief. The plea did not rewrite history. It simply established responsibility. In August 2020, D'Angelo was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, along with additional years for other offenses. The sentence ensured that he would remain in prison for the rest of his life. The man who had once moved through California under the cover of darkness would never again walk free. The legal conclusion was extraordinary because of the time involved. More than 40 years had passed between the beginning of the crime series and the arrest. The defendant was already in his 70s when he finally faced punishment. The victims had waited through entire stages of their lives. Some had spent more years knowing the crime than knowing the identity of the person responsible. The sentence could not restore what had been lost, but it gave the case a final legal boundary. There would be no more searching for the killer, no more wondering whether he was still alive, no more unidentified DNA profile sitting at the center of the investigation. The name was known. The offender was convicted. The sentence was imposed. The Golden State Killer case had reached its legal conclusion. Yet the most remarkable part of the story was not the sentence. It was the path that had made the sentence possible. The case had begun in a world without modern DNA profiling. It had survived through decades of technological change. The original biological evidence had been preserved. DNA profiling eventually established a common offender. Traditional databases failed to produce a direct match. Then genetic genealogy created a new possibility. Distant relatives became clues. Family trees became investigative maps. A potential suspect emerged. Surveillance produced discarded DNA. The DNA matched. The suspect became a defendant. The defendant became a convicted murderer. It was a chain that stretched across generations of forensic science. The Golden State Killer had once seemed to represent the ultimate cold case, a criminal who had escaped identification despite enormous investigative effort. His capture demonstrated something different. Some cold cases are not impossible. They are waiting for a new method. The evidence may already exist. The missing ingredient may be technology, persistence, or a new investigator willing to ask a different question. In this case, the question changed from who matches this DNA to who is genetically related to this DNA. That change opened a door that had remained closed for decades. The case also changed public understanding of what genetic genealogy could accomplish. Before the Golden State Killer arrest, many people had never heard of investigative genetic genealogy. Afterward, it became one of the most discussed tools in modern forensic investigation. Law enforcement agencies began examining old DNA profiles and asking whether similar methods could identify other unknown offenders. Cold case units revisited evidence that had once been considered exhaustive. Families of unidentified victims began hoping that their own cases might finally receive the same breakthrough. The Golden State Killer investigation had shown that the passage of time did not necessarily make DNA less valuable. In some circumstances, time could make it more valuable because technology continued to advance. The evidence had been waiting for the future, and when the future arrived, the killer's anonymity collapsed. For the victims and their families, however, the scientific breakthrough was never simply about technology. It was about names. For decades, they had known the crimes without knowing the person behind them. Now the unknown had become known. Joseph James Dengelo was no longer a shadow moving through California neighborhood. He was a convicted murderer serving life without parole. The fear had a name. The mystery had an answer. And the evidence that had remained silent for more than 40 years had finally spoken. The sentence brought a legal ending to the Golden State Killer case, but it did not bring the past to a complete stop, because for the people who survived the attacks and for the families who lost loved ones, justice was never going to be measured only by the number of years Joseph James Dengelo would spend behind bars. The courtroom had finally established responsibility, but the deeper story was about what happened to the people who had been forced to live with the crimes long after the police files went cold. For decades, many victims had carried a question that could not be answered. Who did this to me? Some had known only a description. Others had known only a terrifying nickname. Families of murder victims had carried an even heavier question. Who killed the person we loved? The arrest in 2018 answered the first question. The guilty plea and sentencing answered the second, but the emotional consequences were much more complicated. A cold case can remain open on paper while becoming an invisible part of someone's daily life. The investigation may stop appearing in newspapers, but the memories do not necessarily disappear. Survivors can move to different cities, marry, raise children, build careers, and grow old, yet still remember the sound of a door opening in the night or the feeling of realizing that someone had entered their home. The Golden State Killer case revealed how profoundly a crime can outlive the criminal investigation. The attacks ended decades before D'Angelo's arrest, but their consequences continued into a completely different era. Some survivors were forced to confront the strange experience of seeing their attacker become a national news story after decades of anonymity. The face that had once existed only in memory or police sketches suddenly appeared on television screens and newspaper pages. The name that investigators had spent years trying to discover was suddenly everywhere. For some victims, the news could bring relief. For others, it could reopen wounds they had spent years trying to close. And for families of those who had been murdered, the identification created an entirely different kind of emotional collision. They had spent decades wondering whether justice would ever come. Now it had, but justice arriving after 40 years is not the same as justice arriving immediately. The victims had lost time that could never be recovered. Children had grown up without parents. Parents had grown old without answers. Brothers and sisters had reached old age while carrying memories of relatives who never had the opportunity to grow old themselves. The Golden State Killer investigation therefore became a story about time as much as it was about DNA. The passage of decades had protected the offender, but it had also preserved the evidence that ultimately exposed him. That contradiction was at the center of the case. Time was both the enemy and the ally. Every year made the original investigation harder. Witnesses became older. Records became more difficult to locate. Detectives retired. Yet the same years allowed forensic technology to develop. A biological sample collected in an earlier generation could suddenly become powerful in a later one. The evidence did not need to understand the future. It simply needed to survive long enough to reach it. That is what happened with the Golden State Killer. The DNA collected from the crimes became the foundation for a modern investigation. When investigators eventually turned to genetic genealogy, they were not creating evidence from nothing. They were unlocking information that had been preserved for decades. This distinction matters because the breakthrough was not magic. It was the result of careful evidence collection, preservation, technological development, genealogical research, surveillance, laboratory confirmation, and years of investigative persistence. The arrest represented the convergence of all those elements. One generation of investigators had gathered evidence. Another had developed DNA analysis. Another had learned how to use genealogical databases. Another followed the resulting lead. The case became a relay race across time. No single detective could claim the entire victory. The final arrest belonged to the investigators who identified D'Angelo, but the foundation had been laid by officers and forensic specialists who had worked the original crimes decades earlier. Their evidence had survived long enough to matter. That is one of the most important lessons of the case. Cold case investigators are often working with information collected by people who will never know whether their efforts eventually succeed. A detective may preserve a sample without knowing that 40 years later, another investigator will use it to identify the person responsible. A crime scene technician may document evidence carefully without imagining that future science will make the documentation crucial. A witness may provide a statement that seems insignificant at the time but becomes important when combined with evidence discovered decades later. Every piece can become part of a future solution. The Golden State Killer case showed exactly how that process can work. It also exposed the limits of traditional investigative methods. For years, law enforcement had searched for a direct DNA match and failed. That failure did not mean the DNA was useless. It meant the search method was incomplete. Genetic genealogy changed the strategy by looking beyond the suspect himself. Investigators could search for relatives who had voluntarily placed their genetic information into a database. That approach created a new investigative pathway, but it also introduced questions that had not existed before. Genetic information is different from almost every other form of evidence because it can reveal relationships between people who never agreed to participate in an investigation. A person might upload DNA to learn about ancestry, only to discover that the information can indirectly help investigators identify a distant relative. The Golden State Killer case therefore became a landmark in a debate that extended beyond one murderer. How should society balance privacy and public safety when genetic information can connect families across generations? The potential benefits were enormous. If the method could identify one of the most notorious unidentified offenders in American history, it could potentially help solve other murders, sexual assaults, and unidentified person cases. But the power of the technology demanded caution. Investigators needed rules. Databases needed policy. Courts and lawmakers needed to consider when and how such searches should be permitted. The case had opened a new frontier in forensic investigation. There was no going back to a world in which investigators could ignore the possibility of genealogical evidence. The Golden State Killer had demonstrated what the technology could do. At the same time, the case reminded the public that a scientific breakthrough is only useful when combined with traditional detective work. Genetic genealogy did not tell investigators everything. It did not explain the crime. It did not reveal motive. It did not provide a complete biography of the offender. It offered relationships. Investigators had to interpret those relationships and construct a family tree. They had to eliminate people who did not fit. They had to identify a plausible suspect. They then had to confirm that suspect through direct DNA testing. The final proof came from conventional forensic comparison. That combination of old and new methods was crucial. The future did not replace the past. It used the past. The Golden State Killer case was therefore not simply a story about a new technology. It was a story about what happens when old evidence meets new science. The same biological evidence that had once been a dead end became the starting point for an investigation unlike anything detectives of the 1970s could have imagined. The transformation was extraordinary. A DNA profile once represented only an unknown male. Decades later, it became a map of biological relationship. That map led investigators toward a family. The family led them toward a suspect. The suspect led them back to the laboratory, and the laboratory confirmed what the genealogy had suggested. Joseph James Dengelo was the man behind the crime scene DNA. Once the match was established, the years of anonymity ended. But another question remained for the public. How could a former police officer have remained hidden for so long? His background became a source of intense scrutiny. Dengelo had served in law enforcement during part of the period associated with the crime. That fact was deeply unsettling because police officers are trained to understand investigations, evidence, patrol patterns, and the behavior of criminals. The idea that an offender could have had knowledge of law enforcement from inside the system added another disturbing dimension to the case. Yet the ultimate evidence against him did not depend on his occupation or public image. It depended on biology. His life history could create questions, but the DNA provided the connection. That distinction became important because the case demonstrated how misleading appearances can be. For decades, the public imagined the Golden State Killer as an unknown predator somewhere beyond the reach of ordinary society. The reality was more disturbing. He had lived among ordinary people. He had aged. He had family connections. He had an address. He had a history that did not automatically reveal what investigators were searching for. The arrest showed that an unidentified offender can remain hidden not because he is invisible, but because there is no evidence connecting his public identity to the crime until science provides that bridge. The Golden State Killer had benefited from that gap for decades. The DNA closed it. After the conviction, the case became a reference point for investigators facing other unsolved murders. The message was clear. Never assume that an old case is beyond hope simply because traditional methods have failed. Evidence should be preserved. Old DNA profiles should be reconsidered when technology advances. Investigators should remain open to new analytical techniques, and families should not assume that the absence of an arrest means the evidence has stopped speaking. Sometimes it is simply waiting for someone to understand what it is saying. For the victims of the Golden State Killer, that future eventually arrived. It arrived decades later than anyone would have wanted, but it arrived. The man who had once seemed unreachable was identified. The courts recognized his responsibility. He was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. The case that had haunted California for generations finally had an end. Yet the final image of the Golden State Killer story is not the arrest vehicle, the courtroom, or the prison sentence. It is the evidence itself, a small biological trace collected at a crime scene decades earlier, surviving through years of technological change. It had no voice. It had no memory. It could not tell investigators what it had witnessed, but it carried a genetic signature that remained uniquely connected to the person who left it behind. For more than 40 years, that signature waited while the world changed around it. Investigators retired. Victims grew older. Children became adult. New generations learned about crimes that had happened before they were born. Then science caught up. The DNA became a genealogical clue. The genealogical clue became a family tree. The family tree became a suspect. The suspect became an arrest, and the arrest became a conviction. That sequence transformed one of America's most infamous cold cases and demonstrated something that victims' families had never stopped believing. The passage of time does not necessarily erase the truth. Sometimes it only buries it deeper. Sometimes the answer survives in a place no one can see. Sometimes it survives in a box, a laboratory, a database, or a genetic relationship between distant relatives. And sometimes, after decades of silence, that hidden answer finally rises to the surface. For the Golden State Killer, the silence ended in 2018. For the victims and families, the story had been continuing every day since the crimes occurred. The arrest did not erase their memories. The conviction did not restore their loved ones. But it removed one terrible uncertainty. The man responsible was no longer a shadow. He had been found. He had been named. He had been convicted, and he would spend the rest of his life in prison. The cold case had finally become history, but the lesson remained alive. Evidence can wait longer than a criminal expects, and science can eventually reach across decades to expose a secret that someone believed was buried forever. The story of the Golden State Killer did not end with the discovery of Joseph James D'Angelo. In many ways, his arrest created a second investigation, one that reached backward through decades of California history and forced authorities to reconsider crimes that had once been separated by geography, terminology, and time. For years, investigators had worked with different names, different agencies, and different theories. The East Area Rapist Investigation in Northern California had developed its own identity. The original Night Stalker investigation in Southern California had developed another. Victims and families knew their own cases, but the larger connection remained hidden until investigators recognized that the same offender was responsible. The eventual identification of D'Angelo brought those separate histories together. What had once appeared to be multiple mysteries became one enormous criminal story, and behind that story were people whose lives had been permanently altered. The victims were not simply names attached to case files. They were people who had been living ordinary lives before a stranger entered their homes and changed everything. The offender's methods created an atmosphere of terror because he attacked the place people normally considered safest, home. A locked door was supposed to mean security. A bedroom was supposed to be private. A quiet neighborhood was supposed to be peaceful. The killer turned those assumptions against his victim. He entered at night, when people were vulnerable and visibility was limited. He used fear and control to dominate the people inside. The result was not only physical violence, but a psychological invasion that could remain long after the offender had disappeared. For some survivors, the sound of a noise outside could become a warning. A dark window could become a source of anxiety. An unfamiliar vehicle could trigger memories. Ordinary household routines could become reminders of what had happened. These were consequences that did not appear in police statistics. They existed inside the lives of the people who survived. When D'Angelo was arrested, the public often focused on the extraordinary science that had finally identified him. That was understandable. Genetic genealogy was revolutionary, but for survivors, the technology was valuable because it led to a human result. Their attacker had been identified. Their stories had been validated. The crimes were no longer attributed to an unknown predator who had somehow vanished into history. They were connected to a specific individual who could be prosecuted. That distinction mattered. For decades, an unidentified offender could remain almost abstract. He could become a legend, but a name changes the nature of a case. It creates accountability. It creates a defendant. It gives prosecutors someone to bring into court. It gives victims someone to confront. It gives families a person whose actions can be discussed in concrete terms rather than through speculation. The transformation from unknown offender to identified defendant happened quickly once investigators had. The DNA confirmation, the arrest on April 24th, SIL 2018, was followed by an enormous review of evidence. Investigators had to make sure that the crimes attributed to D'Angelo could be supported by admissible evidence. They had to examine old reports, interview witnesses, review forensic material, and work across multiple jurisdictions. This was not simply a matter of announcing that a famous cold case had been solved. The legal system demanded proof. The prosecution needed to demonstrate that the man identified through genetic genealogy and confirmed through DNA was also responsible for the specific crimes charged. The evidence had to survive courtroom scrutiny. That requirement is easy to overlook when a case has become famous. The public can hear that a DNA match has been found and assume the story is finished. But investigators know that a match is only one component of a larger prosecution. They must establish how the evidence was collected, how it was preserved, how it was analyzed, and how it connects to the defendant. They must demonstrate that the chain of custody is reliable. They must distinguish between investigative leads and courtroom evidence. The Golden State Killer case required all of those steps. The genealogical investigation produced a suspect. The discarded DNA produced confirmation. The prosecution then built the legal case around that evidence and the historical record. The passage of time made every stage more difficult. Crimes that occurred decades earlier had to be explained to a modern courtroom. Witnesses had to revisit memories from another era. Prosecutors had to reconstruct events that had happened before some of the people involved were even born. The case became a confrontation between the present and the past. The courtroom was modern, but the crimes belonged to another California. Yet the victims' memories bridged the gap. For many survivors, the details had never completely disappeared. Trauma can preserve moments in ways that ordinary memories do not. The mind can return to an event repeatedly, even decades later. The defendant's arrest, therefore, did not merely revive an old investigation. It revived experiences that some survivors had spent years trying to compartmentalize. The legal proceedings forced the past into the present again. Prosecutors eventually reached an agreement that allowed D'Angelo to plead guilty rather than face a full trial. The decision had practical and emotional consequences. A trial involving decades of crimes and numerous victims could have been extremely long. Survivors might have been required to testify. Families might have been forced to listen to detailed evidence about the murders of people they love. The plea removed uncertainty about the ultimate outcome. D'Angelo admitted responsibility for 13 murders and numerous other crimes, including 13 kidnappings for robbery. The agreement allowed prosecutors to seek multiple life sentences without parole rather than pursue the death penalty. In August 2020, D'Angelo was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, plus additional years for other offenses. The sentence was the formal end of the prosecution, but it was not the end of the story for the people affected by the crime. During the sentencing proceedings, survivors and relatives were able to address the defendant. Their statements revealed the enormous distance between the date of a crime and its emotional consequences. One of the most striking aspects of the case was how old the victims and survivors had become by the time they finally saw the man responsible. Some had been young adults. Others had been parents. Decades later, they had children and grandchildren of their own. The world had changed around them. Technology had changed. California had changed. Their personal lives had changed, but the crime remained part of their history. The sentencing gave them a rare opportunity to place their own words into the official record. The defendant could no longer hide behind an unknown identity. He had to listen as survivors described the consequences of his action. The courtroom therefore became more than a place where a sentence was imposed. It became a place where victims could reclaim part of the narrative. For decades, the offender had controlled the circumstances of the attacks. He chose the time. He chose the location. He controlled the victims through fear. But in court, that balance changed. Survivors had the opportunity to speak. Their voices became part of the case. Their experiences could no longer be reduced to anonymous statistics. The man who had once entered their homes without permission was now sitting in a courtroom listening to the people whose lives he had altered. That reversal was one of the most powerful moments in the entire investigation. Yet even after the sentencing, questions about the broader implications of the case continued. Genetic genealogy had solved the mystery, but it had also created a new debate about privacy. Consumer DNA databases contain information that can reveal biological relationships. A person who submits DNA for ancestry research is not necessarily thinking about criminal investigations, but because DNA is inherited, one person's data can potentially provide clues about relatives who never submitted their own DNA. The Golden State Killer case demonstrated how powerful that information could be. It also demonstrated why safeguards were necessary. Investigators needed to establish appropriate standards for using genealogical databases. Serious crimes might justify certain searches, but the method could not simply become an unrestricted tool for identifying anyone. The privacy implications were significant. Genetic information can reveal family connections, ancestry, and potentially other sensitive biological information. The technology, therefore, required a careful balance between public safety and individual privacy. The Golden State Killer investigation became a landmark precisely because it sat at the beginning of this new era. It showed investigators what genetic genealogy could accomplish. It also forced society to ask where the boundaries should be. Those questions continue to matter as the technology becomes more sophisticated. The case also changed the expectations surrounding cold cases. Before the arrest, many people believed that decades-old murders were nearly impossible to solve if traditional investigative methods had failed. Afterward, families began looking at old cases differently. If DNA evidence existed, perhaps the case was not finished. If investigators had once lacked a database match, perhaps a new method could create one. If technology had changed once, it could change again. This created new hope for families whose loved ones had been killed decades earlier. The Golden State Killer became proof that an investigation could remain alive even when the public stopped hearing about it. But hope had to be balanced with reality. Not every cold case contains usable DNA. Not every DNA profile is complete. Not every crime scene sample survives decades of storage. Not every genealogical search produces a useful relative. Some cases lack biological evidence entirely. Others contain evidence that is too degraded or contaminated to analyze. The Golden State Killer case was extraordinary partly because investigators had preserved biological evidence capable of supporting the new technology. The breakthrough, therefore, should not be understood as a guarantee. It was an example of what becomes possible when evidence, technology, and investigative persistence align. The case also demonstrated the importance of cooperation. Multiple law enforcement agencies had been involved over the years. Different counties had investigated different crimes. Detectives from different generations had contributed information. Genetic genealogists added another specialized field. Laboratory scientists provided the final confirmation. Prosecutors brought the evidence into court. No single discipline solved the case. It was a collaborative effort spanning decades. That collaboration is often invisible when a cold case becomes a headline. The public sees the arrest. It does not always see the years of work behind it. It does not see the detective reading old reports late at night. It does not see the genealogist tracing a family line through generations. It does not see the laboratory technician examining DNA. It does not see the prosecutors organizing evidence from crimes committed before they began their career. The final arrest may happen in one moment, but the investigation behind it can take years. The Golden State Killer case compressed decades of investigative history into one extraordinary conclusion. The man who had been hunted since the 1970s was finally arrested in 2018. 2 years later, he pleaded guilty and was sentenced to spend the rest of his life in prison. The legal conclusion was decisive. Yet the scientific legacy continued. Investigators began using similar techniques in other cold cases. Some cases produced arrests. Others produced identifications of unknown victims or suspects. The technology became a new instrument in the forensic toolbox, and the Golden State Killer investigation remained the case most often associated with its emergence into public consciousness. The story also changed the way people think about anonymity. D'Angelo had apparently believed for decades that his identity was protected by the limitations of the investigative system. He could not have predicted how consumer genetics would eventually change that system. The evidence he left behind remained stable while the world around it transformed. A method that did not exist when the crimes occurred eventually became the method that identified him. That is perhaps the most unsettling lesson of all. Criminals may calculate the risks they understand. They may know what investigators can do today, but they cannot know what investigators will be able to do 20, 30, or 40 years later. Technology moves forward. Databases grow. Scientific methods improve. Old evidence can acquire new meaning. The Golden State Killer's greatest mistake may have been assuming that the limits of his era would remain the limits of every future era. They did not. His DNA waited. Science advanced. And eventually, the two met. The result was an arrest that changed a legendary cold case forever. For the victims and families, the most important fact remained simple. The man responsible had finally been identified and punished. The fear had a name. The unanswered question had an answer. The years of uncertainty had a conclusion. But the case left behind something larger than a single conviction. It left a warning for anyone who believes that time alone can bury a crime. Evidence can survive. Technology can change. Investigators can return. And a secret that seems completely secure can suddenly become visible. More than 40 years after the first crimes, the Golden State Killer was no longer an unknown predator. He was Joseph James D'Angelo, convicted and imprisoned for the rest of his life. The DNA had crossed 4 decades to find him, and in doing so, it transformed not only one investigation, but the future of cold case justice itself. The deeper investigators looked into the Golden State Killer investigation after the arrest, the clearer it became that the case was not simply a story about one brilliant forensic breakthrough, but about decades of separate efforts slowly converging on the same answer. For years, detectives had worked with fragments. A victim remembered a voice, another remembered a face. Investigators documented unusual behavior. Crime scenes produced biological evidence. Different agencies recorded similar patterns. The offender appeared, disappeared, and then appeared again in another community. The pieces existed, but they did not initially form a complete picture. That fragmentation was one of the reasons the case survived for so long. The crimes had occurred across different jurisdictions and under different names, and the terminology used by investigators changed as the investigation evolved. In Northern California, the offender became known as the East Area Rapist. In Southern California, he became known as the original Night Stalker. The two identities were eventually connected through forensic evidence, but for years, investigators were effectively hunting a criminal whose crimes had been divided into separate histories. Once the DNA evidence demonstrated that the same unknown male was associated with crimes across regions, the significance of the investigation changed. The authorities were no longer dealing with isolated incidents. They were dealing with a single offender who had operated across a large area and over an extended period. That realization gave investigators a stronger understanding of the scale of the threat, but it still did not give them a name. The DNA profile remained the most important clue and the most frustrating limitation at the same time. It was powerful enough to connect crimes, yet conventional database searches did not produce the direct identification investigators needed. This was the problem that genetic genealogy eventually solved. But even after D'Angelo was arrested, the scientific importance of the case continued to grow because investigators and the public began to understand what had actually happened. The breakthrough had not come from finding a forgotten confession or a witness who suddenly remembered the killer's identity. It came from combining an old forensic profile with a relatively new method of searching genetic relationships. That distinction made the case a landmark. Genetic genealogy operates on a simple biological fact. Relatives share inherited DNA. The closer the relationship generally, the greater the amount of genetic material they are likely to share, although the exact pattern varies. Distant relatives can still provide useful clues because they may connect investigators to common ancestors. By reconstructing those relationships, genealogists can build family trees that stretch backward through generations and then forward again through descendants. In a criminal investigation, that can transform an unidentified DNA profile from an isolated piece of evidence into a genealogical roadmap. That was what happened here. Investigators were able to identify relatives connected to the unknown DNA profile and use genealogical research to narrow the field. The process required careful analysis because a genetic relative is not automatically a suspect. A person appearing somewhere on a family tree might have no connection whatsoever to the crime. Investigators had to work through generations of relationships and compare those relationships with the known characteristics of the offender. The final goal was not simply to find a person whose family was genetically connected to the crime scene sample. It was to find an individual whose age, sex, geography, and other known information made him a plausible suspect. That process eventually led investigators to D'Angelo, but the case was still not finished. The genealogical research was an investigative lead, not the final proof. Detectives needed a direct comparison. They conducted surveillance and obtained discarded DNA associated with D'Angelo. Laboratory analysis confirmed that the DNA matched the profile developed from evidence connected to the crime. That direct comparison was the critical bridge between genealogy and prosecution. It transformed a family tree hypothesis into forensic evidence linking the suspect to the crime scene DNA. The significance of that moment cannot be overstated. For more than 40 years, investigators had known the biological profile of the offender without knowing his identity. Now the biological profile and a name belonged to the same person. The mystery had changed from who is the unknown man? 2. How will the evidence against this identified suspect be presented in court? That shift also changed the public understanding of the case. The Golden State Killer had become a symbol of an unsolved criminal mystery. The unidentified offender seemed almost impossible to catch because so much time had passed. His identity had become the missing piece that prevented the investigation from reaching a conclusion. Once D'Angelo was arrested, the mythology surrounding the case began to collapse. He was no longer an invisible figure. He was a specific defendant with a documented history. Investigators could examine his movements, his background, and his connections to the places where crimes had occurred. But the biological evidence remained the central foundation. It was the objective connection that did not depend on the public image of the suspect. The arrest also created a wave of renewed attention from people who had followed the case for decades. News organizations revisited old reports. Communities remembered the fear that had once spread through neighborhoods. Survivors were confronted with headlines about a crime they had tried to leave in the past. Families who had waited for answers suddenly found themselves at the center of national attention. The phrase "cold case solved" appeared everywhere, but the people involved understood that solving the identity of the offender was only the beginning of another difficult process. The legal system had to establish responsibility for specific crimes. Prosecutors had to examine the evidence associated with individual murders and kidnappings. Investigators had to revisit historical records. Victims and their families had to decide whether they wanted to participate in proceedings that could force them to relive experiences from decades earlier. The passage of time did not make those decisions simple. In some ways, it made them more complicated. A survivor who was young at the time of an attack might have spent decades building a life around the memory. The arrest could bring relief, but it could also reopen fear. The person they had once known only as a stranger was suddenly identifiable. His photograph was public. His name was known. His criminal history was being discussed. The past had become immediate again. The courtroom proceedings eventually provided an opportunity for victims and relatives to confront the defendant directly. D'Angelo's guilty plea in 2020 meant the case did not require a full trial, but the sentencing proceedings allowed victims and relatives to describe the impact of his crimes. Their statements demonstrated the true scale of the harm. The offender's actions had not ended when he left a crime scene. Their consequences had followed people for decades. The families of murder victims had lived with permanent absence. Survivors had lived with memories that could not be erased. Communities had carried the psychological legacy of a predator who had once seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same. D'Angelo's sentence eventually provided a legal endpoint. He received multiple consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, along with additional years for other offenses. The sentence was severe, but it could not restore the lives that had been destroyed. That reality is central to understanding cold cases. Solving a murder does not undo the murder. Arresting a suspect does not return the victim. A conviction cannot give a family back the years they lost. Justice can establish responsibility, but it cannot reverse time. That is why the scientific achievement of the Golden State Killer case should not be separated from the human consequences. The DNA breakthrough mattered because there were people waiting for answers. The genealogy mattered because there were families who had spent decades without knowing who was responsible. The arrest mattered because survivors deserved to know that the person who had harmed them could no longer harm anyone else. The case also became a warning about the permanence of biological evidence. Criminals may believe that time protects them, but DNA can remain useful for decades if properly preserved. Technology can transform the meaning of that evidence. A sample that once provided only an unknown profile can later become a gateway to an entire family network. This is why cold case investigators continue to review old evidence. The investigation does not necessarily end when a file is placed in storage. It can enter a different phase, waiting for science to catch up. In the Golden State Killer case, that waiting period lasted more than 40 years. During that time, forensic DNA profiling became established, databases expanded, consumer genealogy services became widespread. Genetic genealogy developed as an investigative method, and investigators learned how to combine those tools with traditional detective work. The result was a process that would have been almost unimaginable when the original crimes occurred. A biological trace from a crime scene could eventually point toward relatives of the unknown offender. Those relatives could lead investigators into a family tree. The family tree could identify a potential suspect. Surveillance could produce a direct DNA sample. The laboratory could confirm the match, and the legal system could then take over. That sequence became one of the most important forensic stories of the modern era. It also raised difficult ethical questions. Genetic information does not belong only to one individual in the same way. A photograph or a fingerprint might. It carries information about biological relatives. When someone chooses to participate in a genealogy database, that decision can have implications beyond the individual. The Golden State Killer investigation demonstrated the enormous investigative potential of that reality, but it also highlighted why the use of genetic genealogy requires careful policies and oversight. The technology is powerful precisely because families are connected. That same power makes privacy concerns impossible to ignore. The case therefore became both a triumph of forensic investigation and the beginning of a larger public conversation about genetic privacy. Yet beneath the science and policy debates was a simpler human story. For decades, victims had been forced to live with uncertainty. The offender had remained unidentified. The investigation had continued in different forms, but there had been no name, no arrest, and no courtroom. Then, suddenly, there was a name: Joseph James D'Angelo. The name itself carried no supernatural mystery. It belonged to an ordinary human being. That was perhaps the most unsettling part. The terrifying figure created by decades of headlines was not a creature from the shadows. He was a man who had grown old while the people affected by his crimes continued to live with the consequences. The DNA did not care about his age. It did not care how many years had passed. It did not care that investigators had once failed to identify him. It simply preserved the biological connection. When the technology became capable of interpreting that connection, the past reached into the present. The Golden State Killer had relied on time. He had relied on the limitations of forensic science. He had relied on the fact that investigators could not search every possible family connection in the world. But those conditions changed. The evidence remained. The technology advanced. The investigative method evolved, and eventually the identity hidden behind the DNA was exposed. The case became a reminder that a cold case is not necessarily a dead case. Sometimes the investigation is simply waiting for the right question. In this case, the right question was not whether the unknown DNA matched a known offender. It was whether the unknown DNA belonged to a family that could lead investigators to one. Once that question was asked, an investigation that had stalled for decades began moving again. And once it moved, the distance between an unidentified DNA profile and a courtroom became surprisingly short. The Golden State Killer had disappeared into history, but his biological signature had not. More than 4 decades after the first crimes, that signature became the thread investigators followed through generations of family history. At the end of that thread was a name, an arrest, a guilty plea, and a sentence that ensured the man responsible would never return to the communities he had terrorized. The mystery had survived for decades. The evidence survived longer, and in the end, it was the evidence that won. By the time Joseph James D'Angelo entered the final stage of the case, the investigation had become far larger than the arrest that first shocked California in 2018. The courtroom now carried the weight of decades of unanswered questions, and every piece of evidence seemed to point backward toward a period when the Golden State Killer was still an unidentified predator moving through California communities at night. The crimes had occurred before the internet, before smartphones, before modern surveillance systems, before consumer genealogy databases became part of everyday life. The investigation had been forced to cross an enormous technological gap. Detectives from the original era had worked with paper reports, telephone calls, physical sketches, handwritten notes, and biological samples that could not yet be analyzed in the way modern forensic laboratories could analyze them. Decades later, investigators were operating in a completely different world. Computers could compare information rapidly. DNA profiles could be stored and searched. Genetic relationships could be mapped across generations. The same case had moved from one technological age into another, and the transformation changed what investigators believed was possible. That transformation was especially important because the Golden State Killer had depended on anonymity. For years, his identity was protected by the limit.